I'm your host, Carolyn Solo, LCSW, EMDR therapist, and mom of 3 daughters. Thank you for joining me. Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 47 of the Future Template Parent Podcast. I am your host, Carolyn Solo, LCSW, EMDR therapist, will be PhD in a few days once I pass my defense, and mom of 3 daughters. Next time I record, I'm going to say Carolyn Solo, PhD, once it's official. Thank you for joining me. So last week I covered the top 3 signs to know that you're ready to switch to intensives in your practice. And today I promised that I would share a more clinical topic, which I am going to. I'm going to give you a quick and dirty. Why do I still use that phrase? I don't know. It's kind of weird and a little gross. But anyway, I'm going to give you an overview of the pre-verbal trauma protocol in EMDR and a little bit about how to use it in an intensive. First, I'm going to give you a general overview of why we use it, then a little bit about how to use it, and then some thoughts on using it in an intensive. So it needs to be said before we get into this that there's a ton of complexity with this protocol, and it's often used in really complex cases. So a 30-minute podcast episode is definitely not enough to get comfortable using it and to have all of your questions answered. So please feel free to reach out to me with additional questions. And also, this protocol is something I cover in both my VIP day and will be covering in my upcoming group program. And you'll get a lot more details and specificity on how to use it in those settings. So if this is of interest to you, please feel free to reach out to me so we can work together and I can get you up to speed on this. It's so effective and really life-changing for people. So definitely worth knowing and learning. So let's get into it. So some background on the protocol. I learned about the protocol in a few different ways. I first learned about it during my supervision for certification from my really excellent consultant. And then I also learned a lot more by reading Dr. Sandra Paulson's book, When There Are No Words, Repairing Early Trauma and Neglect from the Attachment Period with EMDR Therapy. And I think I have talked about Looking Through the Eyes, one of her other books that is really instrumental in how I practice, especially with working with people with dissociation and complex trauma. So her books are fantastic. She's just a true expert. And she also has a training, a video, like a record. You can see it on demand. That's what I did. I'm sure she does it live as well. Dr. Paulson's training that accompanies the book or that the book accompanies, whatever. So all of those resources are available to you. And of course, I'd be happy to consult with you more as well. So a lot of ways you can learn about it. So just I'm just going to give you a little insight right now. Sorry, I was looking out the window. I saw something. So why do we need an early attachment trauma protocol? Well, a big reason is this idea of implicit memory, right? So we have implicit memory and explicit memory. Explicit memory is memory that we can easily recall or somewhat recall. And implicit memory is kind of encoded in our brain, but we maybe have body sensations or vague dreamlike images, but we can't recall it and recall all the elements of a trauma memory that standard protocol requires, okay? When an event or events happened too early to be encoded into explicit memory. It's really hard to access a SUD or a VOC or a cognition when we're dealing with really vague, even just like somatic only memories. And it's so important that like years 0 to 3, as we know, are the most crucial years in terms of encoding in our brains, like our, ability to attach securely. So processing the traumas and the needs that did not get met from those years is crucial for healing for a lot of people, but it's really hard to do with standard protocol, right? SUD, VOC, cognition, these are all left brain things. And implicit memory is stored in your right brain. It is the unconscious. So, it's really hard to set up with the assessment as we learned it, that standard protocol. So as we all know from attachment theory, a loving, tender, predictable attachment relationship from the birth of the baby, even before, honestly, when the baby's in utero, is essential for the development of a secure attachment. And about the in utero stuff, like you've probably had some medical appointment in your life, or maybe you even do this in your own intake, had questions asked like, was it a normal pregnancy? Were you born early? Was your birth traumatic? Like, because those things actually matter. And we know that they have, health impacts, both physical and psychological. So obviously there is, if you were the product of, if you were not a wanted pregnancy for a variety of reasons, whatever that means, the experience of being in utero as an unwanted pregnancy is going to be different. And stress hormones and, maybe how the mother cares for the baby in utero if it's not a wanted pregnancy, these things matter, right? So yeah, just a little bit about not even just pre-verbal, but pre-birth trauma. So early trauma is developmental trauma, and repeated developmental trauma, is going to contribute to disrupted attachment. And, repeated developmental trauma is what we consider to be the foundation of complex PTSD, right? And it can be neglect, it can be abuse. If we're talking about extremely severe abuse, that might start moving into the realm of like significant dissociative disorders. But certainly extended developmental trauma will lead to CPTSD at the very least. And also the healthy early attachment relationship is a right brain experience, right? An attuned right brain of a parent attuning to the right brain of the infant. It's all unconscious. And if we're talking about pre-verbal trauma, we're most likely talking about disruptions to the development of this secure, attuned right brain to right brain attachment process. Of course, it is possible that there could be a single incident trauma during the implicit memory period that impacts the individual that's not attachment-based and happened in the context of a secure attachment, like a house fire, a car accident. They would also could need processing, and their pre-verbal trauma protocol could work, but some of the interventions and the preparation that is needed with early attachment trauma may not be necessary in the same way. But it's still going to be implicit, it's still going to be right brain. We still need to access the right hemisphere when we're processing, even if it's just a quote single incident trauma. So when clients come in for an intensive, it's most likely that they are coming in to process something that happened later in life, right? That's encoded in their explicit memory. However, there can be times when processing is getting stuck, float backs aren't working, the person's getting only vague sensations, vague images, or you've gotten developmental history that indicates that there are significant attachment ruptures, right? Another all this could indicate that you may want to use the early traumatic event protocol, early trauma protocol, is noting major dissociation when you get to phases 3 and 4, or even before. If you weren't already aware of a history of dissociation in an intensive client, if a client starts to dissociate, well, now you know, and you're not going to ruin them. It's not the end of the world. But you will want to think more carefully about how the rest of the intensive will be structured. It may be best to contain some memories and proceed with doing more ego states and parts work for much of the remaining time together. If you're trained in those approaches, as I am, and I can certainly help you develop those skills. If you want to learn more about dissociation, go back and listen to episodes 14, 16, and 17 for a much fuller exploration of dissociation in general and intensives. So I can't possibly explain all the nuances of this protocol in a short episode, as I've said, but I do want to highlight a few differences that will give you a sense of, why is this a different approach than like the recent traumatic event protocol or standard protocol. And if you've listened to the podcast a lot, you know that RTEP, the recent traumatic event protocol, is usually what I use to guide structuring my intensives. So it would be good to think about how this is different, right? So first of all, if you're getting a sense that you need to use the early trauma protocol, and maybe that happens in the middle of an intensive, then you may need to go back and do more extensive phase 2 stuff because the necessary resources for effective processing may not be there. Some of the resources that often come up for early trauma that you need is installing an ideal primary caregiver figure, a protocol that you can find in many places, even if you just do a Google search. It's in Dr. Paulson's book. It's also in Dr. Laurel Parnell's book on attachment-based EMDR, which I have talked about in other episodes. It's in a lot of places. So that's something you'll probably need to do. In Dr. Paulson's book that I've been talking about, the Where There Are No Words, she groups the preparation elements that are necessary in early trauma into 3 areas: containment, the safe state, and resetting affective, not effective with an E, affective with an A, right? I still get those confused sometimes, but affect is like your emotional state at the moment, right? Versus, right, versus mood, which is longer. Like I feel like what I've always heard is like, your mood is like the climate, your affect is the weather or something. Something like that. But a little bit about each of those 3 things. Containment means what it sounds like it means, right? Using the container. But, when you have a client that you're doing container with who's like relatively stable, you probably just take a few minutes to do it. And then, you use it repeatedly, at the end of other different sessions. But with clients who've had early trauma or who have complex trauma, who are dissociative, you may need to practice it repeatedly over and over again before you move on from it. And it may take many attempts before they're able to do it successfully. If a client has many dissociated ego states, you may need to have a different container for different ego states and install those separately. And as you can imagine, that can take time. It takes also knowing what those separate ego states are. So just a couple thoughts about containment there. The next one that Dr. Paulson mentions is safe state. We all learned, well, most of us, maybe not all, maybe this has changed in basic training, about safe place in our EMDR basic training, right? But safe state is slightly different, right? It indicates a felt sense in the body and also an emotional sense that feels safe. So it could be a place, but it doesn't have to be a place, okay? It could be a moment in time. It could be a relationship. It could be a feeling. It could be a pet, being with a pet or something. Most important is the felt sense, the somatic sense of safety. And similar to what I said about container, it could be that different ego states need different safe states. It could take a while. It could be really, really tough to do that, or not tough, but it could be a process, right? So this is why, resourcing is going to take longer. And remember, if you don't even quote, get to phases 3 and 4, if you're working with early trauma and you do phase 2, that's great. That's amazing. Those are resources that a client can take with them. And maybe they come back to you in the future. Maybe they go back to another EMDR therapist to work hourly. It's still really useful. So, even if you don't get to phase 4 with a client who has a lot of early trauma, that's okay. Finally, the last preparation phase that Dr. Paulson talks about is resetting affective circuit. So I'm going to quote from her book, and this is sort of like what she says Dr. Paulson would say to a client, right? Quote, "We need to make sure your emotions are working the way they were intended to work." So this is in very client-friendly language. So emotions to work as they were intended to work, as sources of important information to help us learn what's dangerous, what's unfair, what's connected, what connection feels like, and more. They are there at the beginning of our lives, these emotions. If you watch a new baby, no one has to teach them how to feel, right? Babies have feelings. They scare, they cry, they're happy. Like, those feelings are there. But many people have been taught to ignore feelings and may have learned it's not okay to feel some feelings. Maybe they've had to hide their feelings, and so they disconnect from their feelings, right, through life. And that's like kind of clipping the dashboard wires in your car when you've learned to ignore those feelings. So that's how she describes it. So she divides the affective circuits into protective and life-giving. So the protective ones are shame, fear, rage, panic, and kind of all the secondary emotions that go with those. And then life-giving is like pride and joy is one. Seeking and curiosity is one. Love and lust is one. Care and play. Okay. So there's a protocol within their early trauma stuff that actually works through each of those emotions and like accessing them and learning how to feel them using slow BLS to make sure the client can access them appropriately and safely. Again, this could take a long time. And once you've done these 3 steps, this is where you may be also installing the equivalent of nurturers, wise figures, protectors, other RDIs, where an ideal caregiver would come in. Again, I said lots of details, but just to give you an overview of how the preparation phase could be different. And again, we can talk more about this one-to-one, but there's too much in here for a podcast. And then a little bit about phases 3 and 4 and how it's different. So as I said earlier, you're not going to be able to access all of the elements that standard protocol requires for processing. What early trauma indicates, the early trauma protocol indicates for phases 3 and 4 is choosing periods of time as targets, like within that 0 to 3 period, maybe even the pre-birth period, and just seeing what floats up. Could be vague images, could be sensations, could be visuals that are kind of dreamlike. It's not essential at all. In fact, it's impossible to know if these targets, quote, really happened or if they're accurate to do this work, right? That doesn't matter at all because it's about the felt sense, the experience that the person has embedded in their nervous system. So for each time frame, phase 3 will essentially look like just taking whatever floats up for a client when connecting to a specific time frame and just going with it without trying to understand it. Trusting that implicit memory and what is stored in the body will reveal what needs to be revealed. Usually this starts with a felt sense, very somatic. And sometimes negative and positive cognitions can emerge, but they're not going to be there at the beginning, right? But the therapist is going to track those as they come up. So for phase 4, often somatic bilateral stimulation as opposed to eye movements is preferable. Of course, always ask for consent, give options. You can always switch off and on. But self-tapping, buzzers, or maybe even having the therapist gently tap on the client's knees, maybe their ankles, to access more somatic material, that might be helpful. Of course, with consent, we're not going to touch a client's body if they don't want us to, of course. But sometimes that close physical connection can also be soothing. And then there's some research that shows that eye movements access more cognitive material, which again, we're not going to have a connection to with this early trauma. Excuse me. And you're also not going to explicitly track the SUD, like I said, because there really isn't going to be a SUD to start with. You're just going to sort of see, does it feel better? Are things improving? And then another thing to think about with phase 4 is that you may have to break up the time frames that are different targets into very small pieces, right? And the more trauma that happens in the earlier years, the smaller the pieces will be. And there's a way to do this. And again, I'm not going to go into it now, but the book talks about it, the training talks about it, you can talk to me about it, but it is really important to kind of have a sense of how these different pieces really, really need to be played out because this stuff can cause a lot of dissociation actually because it's so early. And the closing of an incomplete target is incredibly important with this protocol, right? Since the material being processed is implicit, it's even more likely, you're really stirring up unconscious stuff. It's even more likely that emotional and somatic flashbacks and nightmares will happen between sessions. Nightmares are unconscious, right? Dreams. So when you've accessed that, when you've gone there already, that stuff is going to be more quick to come up, right? So you need to spend a lot of time closing down these incomplete targets. You need to do what Sandra Paulson calls tuck in all of these very young parts because they're incredibly young, we're talking 3 and under, and take extra care to be sure that your client has contained everything, that all parts feel safe. Maybe they all have to go back to their safe state. Your client is regrounded and you want to be really sure they're regrounded and take your time to be sure of that. This can take around 20 minutes, right? Which is another argument for time and space and extended sessions. Like I said, right? Dissociation with early trauma, much more likely. So you might just switch your approach when you find out about there's significant dissociation, do more ego states work. You might even at this point need to refer out if that feels better to you. I would love to get clinicians to a place where this does not feel totally overwhelming, the idea of working with trauma and dissociation in EMDR, but it is something you need training in. But it's something that all of us do need training in because it happens way more than we realize. So little spiel on that. Also really important, although these elements, of course, are vital for every therapeutic relationship, is when you are working with someone who has profound early life trauma, you need to create and provide a safe, soothing space, okay? It's extra important to modulate your voice. Soft, slow, calm. That can be hard for me because, I'm high energy. You want to use soft lighting. You want to have lots of blankets and pillows. Maybe you want a place where they can recline and put their feet up, not just a hard chair, although I hope most of us aren't using hard chairs for clients to sit in. That happened in community mental health too. We had 2 plastic chairs. It was terrible. You want to have essential oils if that helps ground people or is soothing. Fidget toys, drawing supplies. Offer tea, water, coffee. I know there's caffeine in coffee, maybe not for everybody, but for some people it's soothing. Have light snacks available. All of these things, and the sense that the client feels that you are caring for them and making this experience a priority, will allow them to be in a more resource state and process more effectively. So much more to learn about this protocol, but a little bit of insights into how it's different from standard protocol, just to kind of get you thinking. So why does this work well in an intensive format? Well, quoting again from Sandra Paulson's book, she says, psychotherapists will likely need to conduct ET sessions within 45 to 50 minute or 90-minute sessions. Why does she say that? Because most of us have structured our practice that way because insurance dictates it, or we just don't think that there's any other possibility. But then she goes on to say, preferably, however, extended sessions of half to full day sessions structured with breaks are the ideal way to employ the early trauma approach. This is because in brief sessions, clients and therapists are more typically operating in a left hemisphere frame of reference. I have seen this so much. It takes a long time to get into your body, okay? A lot of us are more in our thinking brains during those short sessions. Just the fact that you know that there's a clock ticking takes you out of your body. It really does. So again, I feel like she's aligning with everything I believe here. Extended sessions matter so much. It could be a very good idea to do an intensive in which you're just doing early trauma, right? Maybe this happens because the client's working with an hourly EMDR therapist and they become very aware of early stuff and they decide to refer to someone who does intensives. This could happen when you're doing an intensive that you think is going to focus on something else, but then you realize that the ET should be the focus. You could also advertise this and market this as specifically something you do, this early trauma. So yeah, lots to consider, but hopefully this provides a little bit of an introduction to those of you who aren't super familiar yet with early trauma protocol. And if you still have questions, well, you know who to ask. And any kind of coaching and the EMDR consultation I do will cover this if this is of interest to you. And I think it should be. I think it's an incredibly vital tool to have in your toolbox. And like I said, I have my VIP day, which is a 1-to-1 get your intensives up and running package in a single day. We certainly will go over this. You'll get access to my Google Drive of the tools that I use with this early trauma stuff, things that I just sort of handouts and, the descriptions of the steps and all those things to keep you kind of on track and to give you some resources to take away with you. And we'll also cover it in my upcoming group program, which is going to be in September through December. I'll teach you how to use it in more detail, of course, and you can ask all the clarifying questions that you want to. So reach out to me for more info about any of that. So wrapping up, today I shared a little bit about the early trauma protocol, the pre-verbal trauma protocol. I hope this piqued your interest. It's so valuable to know this, but it's complex. There's a whole book about it. It's not something that you can be like, oh, I read a thing on the internet and now I'm good to go. Like I said, I did consultation on it. I read the book and I did the training and I continue to practice it. And that's why I feel competent in it. If this resonated with you, please feel free to reach out with more questions. On Instagram at FutureTemplateParent, my website, www.futuretemplateparent.com. Next week's episode is going to cover moving away from the clinical back into kind of the marketing space. It's going to cover something that many of us private practice therapists struggle with, dealing with our limiting money mindset. I'll share some of my journey in this area, specifically how I've gone from charging $2,500 for a 15-hour intensive to $5,000, which is what I do now for the same length of time. So I will give you kind of my story, the blocks that I experienced, how I kind of worked through them. Hopefully that will be inspiring and helpful to you. So have a great week, everyone. Thank you so much for listening as always. And I will talk to you next week. Take care, everybody.